So over the past around 8 years, my fascinations have consistently revolved around the various limitations of the world's transition to clean energy. Those defined by material science, on the technologies we can practically produce, those defined by macroeconomics, on how we can deploy them, and those defined by politics, on just how quickly the clean energy transition can take place. The critical centerpiece of my journey so far was undoubtedly my 3-year stint living, studying, working in China. Beyond testing my personal limitations, such as my ability to adapt to a new culture, learn a new language, my experience in this country set me on a path to understand the limitations of a clean energy economy, and ultimately how those limitations can be challenged and potentially even surmounted. So today I'm going to discuss with you the limits within 3 contexts, while also trying to paint a picture of my experiences at Northwestern and since graduation in Beijing, New York, DC, and now Berkeley. I've been around a couple places and hope to settle in Berkeley for a few years since it's a nice place. So just to reiterate those limits, those defined by material science on the technologies we can practically produce, those defined by macroeconomics on how we can deploy them, and those defined by politics on how quickly the clean energy transition can take place. I studied material science in college because my imagination was captivated by the idea that this discipline truly pushed progress in a world of physical limitations. If I invent something, and it's not, say, an idea or software, but it's actually something physical, one of the first questions I ask is, what am I going to make it out of? If I'm designing the fastest car, I need a material that's strong enough, yet also light, strong enough to be safe, and cheap enough for the target consumer. Now, if I want to power the world with solar energy, I'm going to need a material with a cost and efficiency balance such that potentially even the world's poorest consumer could afford it. So I set out to put my growing set of skills in physics and material science, experimentation, to find the true physical limitations of renewable energy. I worked with Professor Lincoln Lahan on nanowire research with an Office of Fellowships undergrad research grant and a Murphy Society undergrad research grant in nanoscale engineering and design. I studied confocal scanning photocurrent microscopy of nanowires. I studied this new microscopy technique so I could gauge the electronic properties of nanomaterials and gauge their use, potential use in solar cells. The research was productive. I published my findings. I was able to present research around the country and then in Switzerland. And I was terribly excited at the prospects of nanotechnology for various clean energy solutions, solar, energy storage, fuel cells, and how this could push the limits, the boundaries of clean energy. And I think this is something that Northwestern is incredibly aware of across all departments. However, throughout my senior year at Northwestern, I spent more and more time thinking about what my professor taught me during a summer course at the University of New South Wales in Australia. One of my classmates is actually coincidentally present here today. He spoke about the balance of influence between economics and policy for the future of clean energy. Specifically, he taught us that for clean energy to be truly competitive and revolutionize the energy industry, the cost would have to be lower than that of conventional fossil fuel-based generation. Indeed, clean energy costs have fallen precipitously. Just look at this chart of solar module prices by Bloomberg New Energy Finance, a company I used to work for. Let me just give a quick overview of what's going on here. So on the y-axis, we have solar module prices in dollars per watt. And on the x-axis, we have deployment of solar installations around the world. And we have 2 lines here, thin film and crystalline silicon. You can see that in both cases, it's following a traditional experience curve. And I actually don't have 2011's number on here for crystalline silicon, but it's even lower. As we're approaching about 50 gigawatts of solar deployed worldwide. So you might look at this and say, that's all manufacturing science. and material science is pushing this experience curve. Then again, you might say that it's the policy actually pushing it. Because since solar is not quite competitive yet, governments need to support the deployment. And after all, it's that deployment which leads to the experience and the drop in price. And here's how clean energy costs compare to conventional generation, in this case, in China. Let me explain this chart. So this is a look at levelized cost of energy. What that means is if you're a developer of a utility scale power project, and say you have a demand for a 10% return on your investment, this is the cost of various technologies to produce 1 unit of energy, a kilowatt hour. So basically here you have the 4 most common methods of power production in China: large hydro, coal, nuclear, and small hydro. Here you have all of the promising renewable technologies. Solar PV, and this is actually from 2010. This could be the range of prices you could see based on engineering conditions, solar resource. But this white dot indicates kind of where the central scenario would be. But it's probably somewhere closer to here and dropping and dropping. Wind, offshore, biomass, waste energy, wind onshore. And so you can see that some of these technologies are getting actually very close to price. So is clean energy cheap enough? Potentially, quite soon. But I want to ask a different question. Is being cheap enough? What I mean is, certainly clean energy that is cheaper than fossil fuel energy will be a boon for the industry. But the pace of change in the energy industry is largely determined by regulation and length of investment cycles. Look at this chart of the various lifetimes of energy use products and infrastructure that we use every day. Sorry, this may be a bit small. Cars. You have a car for 8 to 15 years before you buy a new one. Think of your home. When was it built? Might have been built in 1940, and it's still standing. And the turnover in power stations, this is incredibly critical for clean energy's transition. Power stations are built with 30 to 50 or even longer timescales. A power station that was built yesterday in China will be there for at least 20 years, if not longer. So this is a critical question when considering how quickly we can change. Certainly you can retrofit energy efficiency, but what about putting innovative, new methods of energy generation and use into place? It takes time. So I was thinking at that time in my senior year, while a PhD in material science would allow me to innovate cheaper clean energy technologies, again, was being cheap enough? From a lab bench, I would likely never become familiar with the critical interplay between clean energy and conventional energy technologies, and become familiar with the impact of government policies on the industry. China, where both conventional and clean technologies were taking off, afforded a unique view of that bigger picture I was looking for. I was eager to see the development firsthand and do field research on the actual clean energy installations popping up around the country as a result of those policies. And so I applied for a Fulbright Scholarship to support my research for my second year in China, with the steadfast support of the Office of Fellowships. However, I wanted not only to see these developments across the country for myself, I wanted to share them with a global audience, especially America. This was in part provoked by my aversion to one-sided foreign reporting on China's environmental degradation, epitomized by the New York Times series, Choking on Growth. This was typical reporting that you would see on China in 2007. China as the dirtiest country on earth, dirty and getting dirtier, with no hope for recovery. Yes, China was extremely polluted and still is, but a more nuanced approach was required to assess its efforts in clean energy. Together with my best friend in China, we created a bilingual video podcast called China's Green Beat. This is the website. I encourage you to log on when you get home. All these little dots are videos we've made around the country. You can see I have strongholds in Yunnan province and around Beijing and Shandong, but I haven't dominated the whole country yet. So I have to get back there and really get into the hinterlands and up in here. But here you can see, for instance, an episode on geothermal energy, right in Beijing. In one episode, me and my friend, we took a train from Beijing to Jinan, which is the provincial capital of Shandong province. Then we got on a bus to Huzhe, and then we got on a smaller bus to Little Shanxian County. We got there at night, and my friend got off the bus to go quickly to the ATM right there and grab some cash. He came back half a minute later, and there was a circle of about 30 people standing around me. Apparently, Americans don't often go to Little Shanxian. Well, there we documented the implementation barriers for the first biomass power plant in the country, and for the sector as a whole, in displacing any portion of China's dominant coal-fired power fleet. Later that year, the podcast was featured on the homepage of YouTube during the Beijing Olympics. Thousands of Americans were tuning in and learning about clean energy in China, from the narrations, interviews, and Mandarin eco-rap interludes that comprise the Green Beat podcast. See, now you want to watch it. Later in 2009, China wasn't the dirty country on earth anymore. It was the greenest country, according to international media and many NGOs, the world's green superpower. Its clean energy investment was taking off. And right in 2009, this is billions of dollars invested in clean energy. It was now occupying the #1 slot in the world. China's manufacturing base was growing so rapidly. I visited Yingli Solar, which is one of the world's #1 solar module manufacturers now, in a city called Baoding, 2 hours south of Beijing. When I went the first time in 2007, I saw a modest factory producing 200 megawatts of solar modules a year. When I went back again in 2010, there was 10 times as much capacity, with plans for twice that much a year or two later. My colleagues and I had lunch with the chairman of the company, the aptly named Chairman Miao. And this guy was really a character. He came, we were all in suits and ties, and he came in his worker outfit, which he designed for the company. Everyone wears the same worker outfit with the logo that he designed, and that's what he rolled up to lunch in. And there we were, clinking Baijio glasses, and my colleague asked Chairman Miao an open-ended question about the global potential for solar energy, to which he simply responded, "We have one world under one sun. There are no countries, just one huge market." Men like this bleed ambition in China, and they're a dime a dozen. But was China the green superpower? Yes, they were installing more wind power than any other country. They were also adding more coal-fired power than any other country by a huge margin. This is annual power grid capacity growth for the past decade. For the past 7 years, China has added a California of power every year. California's grid is around 70 gigawatts in size. China's is now 1,100 because of the growth in each of the past 7 years. But you can see the growing wind installations in very large numbers, #1 in the world in annual installations. The incredible amount of large hydro being installed. But the coal-fired power base is incredibly dominant. So 2010, China is making massive investments in solar and wind, while in the US, attempts to implement cap-and-trade legislation have fizzled. The media declares that China is eating our lunch in clean energy. Responding to this claim, I led a team of analysts at Bloomberg New Energy Finance to produce a white paper discussing the clean energy competition between the US and China. Using a combination of comparative policy analysis and economic data on solar module and wind turbine components, we showed that the actual trade dynamics were more nuanced than a zero game would suggest. I'm going to quote a few experts from the report here. And it is, if you just search for Joined at the Hip, you can download this paper for free as well on the internet. First, the two countries together are clean energy giants. They account for 2/3 of global wind turbine demand in 2010 and over half of supply. China now accounts for around half of solar module production globally. Together in 2011, the US and China accounted for 40% of total clean energy investment globally across all sectors. Second, Chinese companies lust after the US market. They're dominant in Germany and Europe, but their eyes are on the US. At the World Cup, Yingli Solar had ads every other minute at field level. Next to those ads, McDonald's. The joke was that China makes solar modules and the US makes hamburgers. Yingli buys advertisements at MetLife Stadium in New Jersey, which is the US second biggest solar market after California. They read, "Go Jets, go green, go solar, go Yingli." Well, they might say "Go Giants" now. Chinese solar companies have been successfully exporting into the California PV market, taking up more than half of the market share there recently. On the wind side, however, significant barriers remain before Chinese wind turbines turn up in large numbers on US horizons. The Chinese are starting to invest their dollars in our energy sector in actual assets as well. This is not a bad thing that many protectionist congressmen fear. Ambassador Gary Locke has actually made Chinese outbound investment into the US a priority for his tenure in Beijing because it creates many American jobs. Third, end product sales should not be the sole focus of any US-China clean energy comparison. You have to look at the whole value chain. A more detailed analysis reveals that US companies would capture around half of the value of a hypothetical US wind farm that does install a Chinese wind turbine. In PV, capital equipment sales and system installation are proving to be significant value creators for US companies. A separate report by Green Tech Media noted the $2.5 billion in polysilicon, the raw material that makes solar cells, that the US exported to China in 2010, with a $1.9 billion net positive trade balance in the solar PV market overall. Innovation levels at US PV cell and module companies remain high. Nascent US PV manufacturing firms have attracted no less than $4 billion in venture capital and private equity investments over the past 6 years. Publicly listed US PV firms invest more in R&D than their Chinese counterparts. Both suggest that the next big breakthrough in solar technology would come from the US. However, sometimes bad bets are made. Many thin film companies, Solyndra, which you might have heard of, receiving these investment rounds have lost out to crystalline silicon PV because of unforeseen and unprecedented drops in the price of silicon and crystalline silicon modules. Here are the latest figures for 2011 in comparing US versus China investment in clean energy. China had a formidable lead in 2010. But the US regained the lead it originally had back in 2008, this year, investing $56 billion. The reason for this is because two important programs are expiring: the Treasury Cash Grant and the Loan Guarantee Program. So developers rush to get projects in before the end of the year. This shows how reliant on policy support the clean energy sector still is. A focus solely on trade-based winners and losers in the US-China clean energy relationship neglects the gain from both lower cost and higher quality clean energy technology. Both countries, and indeed all countries, will benefit as the US and China drive the cost of renewable energy below that of conventional energy. Is it a clean energy race? Many will paint it this way, but I'm not convinced. Our countries need to cooperate so our companies can compete. Mike Eckert, the former chairman of the American Council on Renewable Energy, said at a recent US-China Renewable Energy Forum in Washington, "In an ideal world, the US and China would use each other's comparative strengths in clean energy R&D and demonstration, respectively, to drive down the cost of clean energy such that deployment can take off in both countries. In reality, the clean energy sector is going through a lot of growing pains. And with the lack of a strong US demand-side policy, like a renewable portfolio standard federally or a cap and trade bill, many US manufacturing companies are suffering. And the blame is falling on China. Last year, it was the Section 301 trade case by the United Steelworkers. This year is the import tariffs on solar modules proposed by US module manufacturers. All the while, solar module prices have fallen, and the US solar market is set to grow incredibly rapidly, creating lots of value and jobs on this side of the pond. So by now, I had gained exposure to both material limitations and macroeconomic limitations of clean energy. What was missing was a deeper understanding of the political limitations around promoting clean energy, although I had started to skim the surface of that in writing the joint at the hip paper. In 2010, international cooperation in the interests of cheaper clean energy for the global community did not appear to be a priority. The focus, rather, was on international competitiveness and green jobs that were promised by politicians. To better understand the political limitations, I joined the International Climate Change Negotiation Team at the US State Department. Here I learned of a full spectrum of diplomatic modes. For lack of better words, I'm going to call them here hard diplomacy, medium diplomacy, and soft diplomacy. Hard diplomacy includes the tough discussions in climate change negotiations and clean energy disputes in the World Trade Organization and other forums, where the media are constantly fanning the flames. Trade discord fuels US-China tension in Copenhagen. How do I know China wrecked the Copenhagen deal? I was in the room. Union accuses China of illegal clean energy subsidies. As you can see, at this level of diplomacy, there are often disagreements, and the media love to point those out. It's a difficult area of diplomacy because you're setting global rules of the game. Medium diplomacy includes the elevated forums such as the US-China Strategic and Economic Dialogue and the presidential initiatives, where there is earnest progress in cooperation and honest discussions on areas of disagreement. The US-China Clean Energy Research Centers were launched when President Obama visited Beijing in November 2009. It's a $150 million research effort with 3 focuses: clean coal, electric vehicles, and building efficiency. As opposed to solar and PV, which are incredibly competitive industries right now, these are the industries of the next 5 to 10 years, the areas of growth, incredible growth. These research consortiums have dozens of universities and companies involved on both the US and China sides. Soft diplomacy is usually well off the front page of the news. It includes such things as technical organizations working on better appliance or better building standards, or new EcoPartnerships sharing best practices on energy efficiency in cities. The EcoPartnerships program, which I worked on at the State Department, highlights partnerships below the federal level. States, cities, universities, and businesses in US and China cooperating together on clean energy deployment and other environmental issues. The China Energy Group, which I now call home at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, focuses on Chinese energy efficiency, working with dozens of sector-level organizations in China. And yes, the Fulbright, people-to-people exchange. Through my exchange to China, I learned an incredible amount from individuals. And I became best friends with Shane Zhao, who's my green brother, who I started China's Green Beat with, and his career in fighting climate change has also taken off. All levels of diplomacy play crucial roles. Hard diplomacy ensures workable and fair global frameworks for clean energy and climate change. Medium diplomacy fosters a conversation and technical cooperation. Soft diplomacy engenders a web of valuable, net positive relationships. I'll just talk quickly about the China Energy Group now. Our kind of bread and butter research all focuses around these 3 areas on the right. The major sources of Chinese energy demand: industrial energy, building energy use, and appliance energy use. So we focus on working with Chinese organizations on the ground in bringing Chinese level of efficiency up to international best practice. more and more we're getting into policy analysis and modeling, and also eco-cities, which are taking off in China. Our two goals are to understand the dynamics of energy use in China and to help the world better understand that, and to strengthen the capabilities of Chinese institutions to promote and implement energy efficiency. So I hope you've learned something from today's presentation about the barriers a clean energy economy faces: technical, macroeconomic, and political. Second, I hope I have been convincing in the fact that the US-China cooperation and competition are both crucial for the future of clean energy. And lastly, how can we remove or overcome the barriers I discussed? When people ask about my Chinese language ability, I often joke I can explain in Chinese how a cap-and-trade bill works, but I can't explain why it didn't pass the Senate. I mean, there's a lot of political reasons there. You got to know all the words for constituents and Republicans and Democrats. It's complicated. I can hardly explain in English why it didn't pass. But I believe it essentially boils down to two reasons. First, passing a bill that induces costs on an economy is difficult during a recession, especially for politicians. Second, the bill would have required radical changes to the way we produce and consume energy. And there are existing business interests opposed to that kind of change. This hypothesis presents two different problems, which must be addressed in overcoming barriers to concerted national action. Because moving to a low-carbon economy involves economic costs, which will burden many existing business interests, there must be both an effort to continuously reduce those costs and more engagement with the public on the necessary economic transitions. I strongly believe that there are yet undiscovered co-benefits to concurrent technological advances and public engagement. For instance, who knows about rooftop solar? I heard you have some on the roof of the Ford building. Well, have you guys heard of Occupy Rooftops? Sounds cool, right? It's a new community Kiva-style based investment model for rooftop solar called Solar Mosaic. They've just called on the public to occupy rooftops. This model will both advance distributed generation while also giving the public a means to occupy and invest in their local communities, battling the idea that the movement hasn't occupied much besides tents and parks. So for your homework, you're going to watch Occupy Rooftops by Sustainable John on YouTube. Lastly, I have some pictures of my time in China. I'm a rather feisty fellow, as you can see here. And this is one of my green brothers, the aptly named Kojiao Killer. A Kojiao is the word for face mask in Chinese. And this is on a trip to Tibet. These are Tibetan nomads in Qinghai province. This is my other green brother. I get a lot of smack for this photo because it's our boy band photo. This is at Tsinghua University, actually, their their green building on campus. This is just at the Great Wall. This is one of my favorite pictures from Beijing. I took it in my first few months there, and it is a full-on double rainbow. I don't know if you guys know about that. And you have the lovely cranes here as well, helping to build that. This is in Shanxi province, an ancient preserved town in Pingyao. These are me and my colleagues at a wind farm in Inner Mongolia, the Summer Palace in Beijing, and with my best friend Matt, also in Tibet, in Qinghai province, with pilgrims who are on their way to Lhasa. And lastly, this is my contact. Yeah, of course, in this day and age, there's like a million ways to get in touch with me. So you can check out my website, and Obama says "Go Cats," and I have to plug organization for my friend, which is actually a growing alumni network sponsored by the State Department called Project Pengyou. Pengyou means friend in Chinese, and it's for all Americans who have lived or studied abroad in China. You should log on and check it out. And I'd love to have some discussion now.